From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of businesses. As we come to air, there's breaking news out of the White House right now. President Trump says that Israel and Sudan have agreed to normalize relations. We remember that earlier there was normalization of relations with the United Arab Emirates and then with Bahrain. At the same time, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had traveled to the region, had talked to the Sudanese, and it was thought this might be in the works. So a major development in the Middle East. We're bringing more as it develops. In the meantime, we're going to get to talk with Ian Bremmer about it. He is, of course, the head of Eurasia Group. That's coming up later this hour. But right now, let's get a check on the markets. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So I'm not sure the stock market knows where to go, but I don't blame it.
So much news out there, David. It is hard for investors to digest exactly what's going on and what might be ahead. What we are looking at this point, though, is a little bit of a down day, similar to the other days this week. And what you're alluding to, moves up and down, fluctuations between gains and losses, telling you neither the bulls nor the bears really have all that much conviction. Something that is happening, though, which is pretty interesting on the day, we once again have a bit of a cyclical or rotation, a reopening rotation happening with the financials, materials, real estate to the upside. And then on bottom, we have tech. And so financials aren't really being helped out by rising rates today, but on the week, yields are higher as bonds sell off. Today, tech really being weighed on by Intel, the chip maker, putting up a disappointing quarter and lackluster guidance. And on the week overall, David, we are actually looking at the first down week for stocks in 4 weeks. So that's sort of interesting as we get closer to the election.
Yeah, that's the stock market. As you and I have talked about this week, maybe it's a little more interesting on the bond side and the U.S. dollar side, because although bonds sort of come back a little bit, they're still up at or above their range, right? And the U.S. dollar is still down a bit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, especially with bonds. I find that to be especially interesting. And if you really want to get nuanced about it and you put the dollar in there, the dollar should actually be climbing as rates go higher, makes it stronger. That has not been happening. But what makes the bond range breaking so interesting is it has pressured stocks. And there's also a range in stocks. The S&P 500 over the last 3 months has been basically stuck in this range. So if this week's decline turns into something bigger, David, we could have the S&P 500 go back toward the September lows. And my sense would be exactly what you're talking about, the opposite happening for yields, pressuring stocks down. We saw that back in June when yields were last at current levels. That was when stocks got a little bit wobbly. All of this into the uncertainty of the election, David.
Yeah, we certainly have that uncertainty of the election. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, in terms of that presidential debate last night, it brought to the fore some stark contrasts between the two candidates, including on energy policy, and in particular, whether we can fight climate change without putting millions of jobs at risk, with former Vice President Biden saying we need to transition away from the oil and gas industry.
I would transition from the oil industry, yes. I will transition.
A big statement.
It is a big statement because it has to be replaced by renewable energy over time. And I'd stop giving to the oil industry, I'd stop giving them federal subsidies.
We welcome now a leader of organized labor. Richard Trumka represents over 12.5 million workers across the country as president of the AFL-CIO. Richard, always a delight to have you with us. The discussion about climate change was all focused on jobs pretty much last night. And I turn to you because one of the things the vice president said was that organized labor supports his view on energy policy. Are you comfortable that that transition away from oil and gas will not cost a lot of jobs in the United States?
I'm comfortable that we'll have a seat at the table and we'll be able to control that so that workers will get to transition and we won't be left behind. Nobody will be left behind. We have to transition, and there are plenty of clean jobs that we can get and give them to the people right now that are working hard. Look, the president has a virtually an all-of-the-above energy policy. I'm talking about the vice president, has a all-of-the-above energy policy that's out there that helps all of us.
So, Richard, talk more broadly about jobs. We had jobless claims out yesterday. We talked with the Secretary of Labor. He said we're coming back. He admits that there are a fair number of people still unemployed, but we're coming back. What is the story from your point of view on that resurgence in the job market?
Well, first of all, you had 1.1 million people filed for new claims this week. That's the 31st straight week that total initial claims were far greater than the worst week of the Great Depression. And we have about 24 million workers who are receiving or are eligible to receive unemployment benefits. That number is shrinking because a lot of people are losing their unemployment insurance. They've expired their 8 months, and there's nothing left on the federal side to do that. The job market is clearly slowing. The recovery that we've seen is clearly running out of speed because they haven't passed the HEROES Act, which would have helped pump back the economy and help workers.
Well, that HEROES Act, the stimulus bill so-called, is one of the things that was discussed last night. Give us your overall impression. Now we're just, 11 days, 10 days away from the election. What's your overall impression of that debate last night?
Well, working families across this country are hurting, like the families that Joe Biden grew up with in Scranton and Claymont. Their families are struggling to pay their bills, to buy a new set of tires, pay mortgages, etc. Biden spoke about their concerns. He talked about his plan to contain COVID-19, to safely and effectively reopen the economy, and to lower health care costs and to protect families with pre-existing conditions. And the president, while he was a little calmer and he interrupted a little less, he still attacked Joe Biden and he lied a lot last night. And he offered no vision for the future. Look, it was clear he really doesn't understand the pandemic. He doesn't know the path of disruption and destruction being leveled by the pandemic. And as a result, he has no plan to end the pandemic safely. And he also, it was clear from last night, he has no plan for health care in America, and especially during a pandemic that endangers the lives of millions of Americans. The debate last night showed a stark difference. The debate was between Scranton versus Park Avenue.
Richard, you mentioned the stimulus, which was discussed specifically last night. Have you given up effectively on the stimulus before the election at this point? I know people say they still have hopes, but as a practical matter, haven't we just about run out of time?
We just about have, and that's a shame because, look, that bill's been on Mitch McConnell's desk for 161 days, and during that time, 135,000 Americans have died. We could have done a lot better, and the economy's now running out of speed. Look, he's paralyzed. Mitch McConnell's paralyzed because he has a group of senators on his side who will do nothing. And then you have the president who's been, the best way to describe it is erratic. First, he doesn't want to give anything, then he wants to give more, and so they haven't been able to negotiate. Nancy Pelosi continues to try. We continue to try and push, but for all practical matters, I think this is done until after the election.
So let's play that out. Let's assume it doesn't happen before the election. As a practical matter, is it any more likely that, for example, Mitch McConnell's going to go along with the big stimulus bill in a lame duck session? Are we really talking about February, and even then only if the Senate really goes Democrat?
Well, I think in the lame duck session we might have some additional leverage to get some stuff done. People are hurting. As I said, families across the country are hurting right now, and they're going to hold, I think, the Republicans responsible for doing nothing during this period of time. Americans continue to die. Health care continues to be taken away. 12 million American families have lost their health care in this pandemic. More and more people are losing their unemployment insurance. Look, they have to do something, and hopefully, after the election, they'll come to their senses and say we ought to put the American public first and not politics first, as they've done for the last 161 days.
Richard, you have your finger on the pulse of an awful lot of Americans, workers across the country. How are you feeling about the election? What do you think is going to happen?
I think you've seen the surge already. American voters, American workers going out to vote in large numbers. They're excited about this election. I think they want a change of direction. They gave Donald Trump a chance. He didn't deliver on his promises. He didn't keep us protected from the pandemic. He doesn't even understand the pandemic, and they know if they're going to change the direction and get the economy going again, they're going to have to elect Joe Biden, and I think they're going to do that.
Okay, thank you so very much for being with us. That's AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka. Coming up here, pollster Frank Luntz is here with the results from the focus group he ran during the debate last night. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
We're learning to live with it. We have no choice. We can't lock ourselves up in a basement like Joe does.
He says that we're learning to live with it. People are learning to die with it.
You also said a vaccine will be coming within weeks.
Yes.
Is that a guarantee?
No, it's not a guarantee, but it will be by the end of the year.
Anyone who's responsible for not taking control, in fact, not saying I take no responsibility initially. Anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as President of the United States of America.
That was a taste of some of what we heard and saw last night at the presidential debate. And for a recap, we go now to Nashville, Tennessee, and the scene of the debate, where our chief Washington correspondent has been covering the event from the beginning, Kevin Cirilli. So, Kevin, thanks for sticking with us through this whole thing. Great reporting. Give us your sense. You could hear a little bit in that little snippet that we had. There was a much more civilized debate than we saw the first time.
Clearly, and based upon my reporting, I can tell you that Republicans, especially upper echelon Republicans close to the president, are breathing a collective sigh of relief that he didn't go the full Kid Rock, so to speak, against Joe Biden, especially on the issue relating to Hunter Biden and as it relates to other more controversial topics, to be quite frank with you. But moving forward, this is all about the swing states. On the issue of immigration, Republicans trying to save Arizona, a state that has 11 electoral votes and a state that President Trump defeated Hillary Clinton by 3.5 percentage points in 2016. Now, polls suggest that Democrat Joe Biden is on the cusp of winning Arizona. Meanwhile, Florida, Cuban, Hispanic, American Catholics breaking for President Trump. Is that going to be enough to push Florida in the direction once again for President Trump? On the U.S.-China trade front, as it relates to U.S.-China policy, this was a rare area where back on Capitol Hill, Republicans and Democrats agree that the United States needs to take a tougher approach against China, David, but they disagree on how specifically to do it. Joe Biden says that he would be tougher on China and better the American worker, making a direct play for Michigan and Wisconsin. And speaking of Wisconsin, President Trump says not so fast, that he renegotiated NAFTA, that he was able to get a better trade deal for some of those workers. And then finally, we've been talking about this all day, but energy, energy, energy. That moment at the end of the debate where Joe Biden was taken on by President Trump on the issue of fracking in particular, where Joe Biden has to look to really a narrow political tightrope to appease the AOC Green New Deal crowd versus Connor Lamb country in the southwestern portion of the state, as well as the southeastern refinery portion of a state like Pennsylvania. He needs African-American turnout to win back Pennsylvania, and it looks like it's breaking for his way in that regard. But elsewhere, look at Senator Kevin Cramer, who defeated Heidi Heitkamp in 2018, the Democrat incumbent in that race. He knows the importance of energy policy in a run-up to an election. David?
Okay. Thank you so much, Kevin, for all your great reporting. We need to get you back in Washington, though, because we got to cover that election together, Kevin. So thanks to Kevin Cirilli.
Yeah.
Frank Luntz
Definitely.
is a master of the real-time focus group, and he ran one last night during the debate composed of undecided voters. I don't know how he found them, but he found some. We welcome Frank now for a readout on what he learned last night. Frank, great to have you with us last night and again today. So what are you hearing from real voters, real people, as opposed to us pundits?
That the pundits don't really understand the real people, that this undecided voter who's now being criticized on editorial pages and by reporters, it's now open season undecideds because those who have decided are mad that there are other people who haven't. But they're not arguing over policy. In fact, the reason why they're undecided is because they don't like Trump's persona, and they're not convinced that they know where Joe Biden's policies are. So it's a very different comparison between the two, and they have to decide, can they hold their nose and vote for Trump because they agree with him, but they really don't want his behavior, they don't want the Trump show any longer, or will they take a flyer, will they take a risk on Joe Biden, knowing deep down that some of the policies are going to be more to the left than what they really want? So it's a balancing act for them, and last night helped some of them decide, but it is so late in this election process, and there are so few people that are still up for grabs.
Well, Frank, I want to ask about that bifurcation you described. Does it take anything away, in your impression, from the enthusiasm of people to vote at all? We have actually a viewer writing in saying, look, a lot of people are voting early this time. Is that because there's the availability of, for example, mail-in ballots? Or might that really indicate a larger participation overall in voting this time?
You got it. It's the second. It's the latter. the people who are voting early can't wait to vote. And I'm not surprised that they're voting against Donald Trump or that they're the Democrats. We don't know how they're voting, but we know that there are many more Democrats than Republicans. And they're doing so because they want to get rid of the president. They want a new beginning. And the idea, the mental process is that if I cast my vote against Donald Trump, I've already gone beyond him. The election's already over for me, and I can start thinking about a new beginning. Now, the Trump people are going to vote on Election Day because their statement is, you're not going to take away our country, you're not going to take away my vote, that I'm going to do it the way that I've done it year after year because I believe in tradition. And we've got such a divergence between those who are voting days early or weeks early versus those that are quite deliberately waiting until Election Day. And the problem, David, is that the way the votes are counted, and I don't know if you want to explore it now or wait till next week, but we're going to have a very different outcome on election night than what we have 3 days later. And I'm not convinced that voters realize what's about to happen with our democratic process.
Well, and one of the issues, Frank, that I've at least gleaned is it may be different state by state. For example, in Florida, they count all those absentee ballots. You'll have it soon after the polls close. The last polls close at 8 o'clock. In other states, they count them later. And so you might have it go blue in one state and red in another state for a period of time and then reverse over time.
Exactly. And in Pennsylvania, they wait till Election Day. Pennsylvania's got one of the biggest surges and very democratic over who's been voting. I think it's 3-1 Democratic, maybe even 4-1. And I'm just afraid that people are going to tune in on Tuesday night because Biden voters think they're going to win. Trump voters think they're going to win. They tune in Tuesday night. The opposite of what the poll shows happens. Trump declares victory, and the votes aren't counted. And that the assumption is with 50% of the votes counted, this is how it's going to go. That is a wrong assumption. And I don't think the media is doing a good enough job explaining to voters it is not election day, it's election week. And we need to give all the votes a chance to be counted. And we need to insist on, to demand ballot integrity.
Yeah, something we always should have insisted on, but maybe we aren't going to have to be patient this time. One last question about that debate last night. President Trump ran for president in 2016 as something of an insurgent going against the swamp as a non-politician. A lot of people would think as an incumbent he'd be running on his record. Last night he tried to revive that insurgency, I think, kept telling Joe Biden he'd been in politics for so long and Donald Trump, really hadn't. Did that work?
I'm not sure. First, I want to give you credit because that's a very keen ear. You were listening very carefully. And I'm not sure that it worked. What Trump needed to do yesterday is ask two simple questions. How much is it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? He asked a third question. You've been in politics for 47 years. If you haven't done it now, why should we expect you to do it? It's a good question. But he needed the other two as well, to bring it back to policy, to bring it back to the economy, because on the economy, Donald Trump wins. On race, on climate, on most of these other issues, frankly, Joe Biden wins.
It's always great to have you with us, Frank. One of the things you've taught me is undecided voters tend to want some facts and figures and some specifics, not just generalities. That is Pollster Frank Luntz, founder of Luntz Global. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow says the ball isn't moving much right now when it comes to a new stimulus package. President Trump had wanted a bill passed by Election Day, but talks are still taking place on Capitol Hill.
It takes a while. You got to vote in both houses. You might have to have a conference vote. Now, that could be done fast, but, it would take a day or two. Just writing up the legislative print of a 2,000-plus page bill takes time. And then you have the issue of the operational executions.
Even if House Democrats and the White House reach a deal, there's no guarantee it would pass the Republican-controlled Senate. The president says he'll cast his ballot in person on Saturday. Mr. Trump voted by mail in Florida's primary this year after claiming there was rampant fraud in the vote-by-mail process. His campaign then began running ads encouraging his supporters to vote by mail. Early in-person voting in Florida began Monday. In Spain, the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says the number of people there who have contracted coronavirus probably exceeds 3 million. That's about 3 times higher than official data would suggest. Cases are surging again in Spain. Prime Minister Sanchez has called on citizens to restrict movement. Nigeria's president is calling for an end to mass protests against police brutality, which have killed dozens of people in Africa's most populous nation. In a televised address, President Muhammadu Buhari warned that authorities will act to protect lives and property. It was the first time President Buhari has addressed protesters directly, one of their key demands since the rallies began more than 2 weeks ago. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Programming note now, join me tonight for Wall Street Week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. 6 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be joined by Larry Summers of Harvard, Katie Koch of Goldman Sachs, and Lori Heinel of State Street Global. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Trump last night talked about a coronavirus vaccine being available by year end. And yesterday, the FDA granted its first approval for a treatment, not a vaccine, but a treatment, remdesivir, to Gilead. Scarlett Fu is here with some of the details.
And of course, remdesivir is one of the treatments that President Trump was given after he was diagnosed. We saw Gilead Sciences, the company, gap higher at the open, rising as much as 4.9%. This is a drug that was originally developed to treat Ebola, and it's now become the first COVID drug to get FDA formal approval. Before that, it was available under emergency use authorization. So Gilead can now move forward with marketing the drug. The new brand name will be Veklury. I'm not sure why they're changing it. There must be something more to that, but given that everyone knows it as remdesivir, it's a bit of a puzzle to me. Gilead had said it would charge U.S. hospitals about $3,100 for most patients. Now, in terms of the numbers, analysts estimate 2020 sales will be about $2.2 billion. The company is expected to sell 1.5 million doses this year. One blockbuster drug, of course, can make a huge difference for a biotech firm, and Gilead will need it because it's getting a lower return from its research and development than some of its peers, only 40% versus, say, 42% at Vertex and BioMarin. Now, the FDA approved remdesivir for emergency use back on May 1st, but if you look at the stock price, it actually hasn't done that well. It's fallen about 23%. Citigroup says that Gilead has first mover advantage, but that only goes so far because the drug will provide a short-term boost for revenue, but sales will actually taper off in the second half when there's more competition from vaccines and antibody treatments are in development right now.
Thanks so much to Scarlett Fu for that report. Coming up next, Ian Bremmer of Eurasia Group. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The coronavirus is picking up steam across the United States. The U.S. added more than 70,000 cases in one day. That's the first time that's happened since July. The rolling 7-day average topped 61,000, the highest since early August. That's according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University and Bloomberg. Italy continues to break records with its coronavirus numbers. Health officials say the number of new cases jumped 19% today to more than 19,000. That's the highest since the pandemic began. Milan, the hardest hit area, started a nighttime curfew Thursday. Italian officials may enact a national curfew within the next few days if the upward trend continues. Turkey confirms it tested its Russian-made S-400 missile defense system despite objections from the United States. Washington has warned Ankara that it risks U.S. sanctions if the S-400 system is activated. It has also suspended Turkey from its F-35 fighter jet program. Ankara insists it was forced to purchase the Russian system after Washington refused to sell it the U.S. Patriot system. Severe weather is wreaking havoc on crops around the world, sending food prices skyrocketing. Drought conditions are ruining wheat harvests in the U.S. and Russia. In other parts of the world, like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, torrential rain is causing rice fields to flood. That's causing prices to soar on everything from sugar to cooking oil. The Bloomberg Agriculture Spot Index, a gauge of 9 crop prices, is up 28% since April to its highest level in more than 4 years. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Okay, thank you so much to Mark Crumpton. Foreign relations were a good part of the presidential debate last night, and today comes the news from the White House that Israel and Sudan have agreed to normalize relations. Welcome now, Ian Bremmer. He's founder and president of Eurasia Group. Ian, great to have you with us. I want to talk about the debate, but first talk about this announcement of Israel and Sudan. Not entirely a shock. I know that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, had been to Sudan in late August to try to get something like this going.
Well, and as you know, there's been movement in getting them off of the U.S. Sanctions list for supporters of terrorism. There was an agreement for Sudan to actually pay for some of those that were affected by American citizens from attacks that they had contested but not effectively denied before. So this now means the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan. That probably is it in terms of big announcements before the elections. But Saudi Arabia is getting closer. They're allowing overflight of Israeli passenger planes. Certainly, Mohammed bin Salman has shown both publicly and privately he's interested in normalizing relations to a greater degree. A much more conservative population would be more backlash for him to do it, especially when King Salman is still there. But in terms of major diplomatic successes that this administration's had, there have been a few. The U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement, certainly efforts on Chinese 5G. But the normalization of relations between states in the Arab world and more broadly and Israel probably ranks right up there.
Yeah, exactly. You have to give credit, no question about it. At the same time, there are some relations that are a little bit more strained. One of them came to the fore last night, once again, with Russia. And we had former Vice President Biden and Donald Trump, the president, really exchanging very conflicting views about what this administration's position on Russia has been. This is part of the exchange.
I don't understand why this president is unwilling to take on Putin when he's actually paying bounties to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan, when he's engaged in activities that are trying to destabilize all of NATO. I don't know why he doesn't do it, but it's worth asking the question, why isn't that being done?
There has been nobody tougher to Russia. Between the sanctions, nobody tougher than me on Russia.
Ian, I guess my real question is, does it make a difference? Whichever of these two gentlemen ends up being president come January 22nd, is there much that really can be done with Russia by getting tough with them?
Well, Russia thinks it makes a difference. If they didn't, they wouldn't be so supportive of Trump. It's pretty clear that the reason Trump, and Biden does know what the reason is, the reason that Trump is so nice to Putin is because Trump believes with some evidence that Putin actually helped him in the 2016 election. I don't think you have to look for economic ties or a P-tape or anything like that. We know that Trump cares more about himself than anybody else. And someone out there that's actually made a difference in his election in his favor, of course he likes that. He'd like it to happen again. But the fact is that Trump has been very constrained, even though he would love to have a reset with Russia, because his entire cabinet and the bureaucracy around him and the Republicans in the Senate and the House have been unwilling to go along. And so it is true that the sanctions under the Trump administration and Congress, Republican Senate, have been tough against Russia. That's not because Trump wants it that way, but that has been the outcome. I do think that U.S.-Russia relations would be more contentious directly under Biden, certainly on human rights issues, certainly on issues like Belarus, where Trump has had nothing to say as a president. Biden would, and I think it would make those relations more uncomfortable. It would make that symmetry more uncomfortable than it had been heretofore.
One of the big foreign relations issues for President Trump, particularly early in his administration, was his relationship with NATO. A lot of nervous people at NATO. The NATO defense ministers are meeting right now, as you know, for their fall meeting. And one of the issues there involves Azerbaijan and Armenia. We have NATO, a NATO member, Turkey, really involved in that, and Russia may have some role in it as well. What is the role of NATO, and to what extent can the United States still use or work with NATO to resolve things like that difficult conflict?
NATO has virtually no influence over the Karabakh issue, unless you want to talk about Turkey, which is technically, formally, a NATO member, and it has been Turkey's support for Azerbaijan's position in this fight over contested territory, Nagorno-Karabakh, that got the Azeris the gumption to engage in unilateral strikes against the Armenians that kicked this all off about a month ago. But the Russians are the country that matters. They're the ones that actually organized tripartite conversations with the two sides. The Turks were not a part of it. They are providing military equipment to both the Armenians and the Azeris, and they have a defense pact with Armenia that so far has not been operationalized because the fighting's been in the contested territory the Armenians hold, but within Azerbaijan proper, while Armenia itself has not been an area where the fighting has gone on. But still, I think that the reason that this war is not going to expand is because Russia has the influence and Turkey does not want a fight with the Russians directly. The reason the fight is going on is because Erdogan, his currency's been in free fall. There's been massive capital flight. His popularity has gone down, and he's been much more aggressive in his region. We've seen it in Libya. We've seen it in northern Syria. We've seen it in the Eastern Med with Cyprus, with the Greeks. And now we're seeing it in Azerbaijan versus Armenia. Turkey increasingly is a rogue actor in its extended backyard, and the Americans and NATO are absent.
Ian, when President Trump came to office, I don't think a lot of us had a good sense of any developed foreign policy approach, what his policies might be, what his theories might be. That's quite different with Joe Biden. I mean, as President Trump kept telling us last night, he's been in the public eye for 47 years now. Do we have a sense of what basic instincts a President Biden, if that came to pass, would have? For example, I've read places that perhaps he'd be more oriented toward North Atlantic and Europe than he would be toward Asia.
I think that would have been true 10 years ago. I don't think it's true now. I think that Biden and his broad team certainly believes that China is overwhelmingly the principal competitor and antagonist of the United States, and that's where orientation needs to be from a national security perspective. Japan will be much more important. India will be much more important. I mean, in that regard, I don't think that foreign policy with Biden will be such a massive departure from that of Trump. Where it will be a massive departure is that climate is going to inform Biden foreign policy to a very big degree. They'll want to coordinate with the Europeans, with others around the world. They'll get back in, that we haven't left the Paris Climate Accord. We would formally very shortly if Trump wins re-election, but we certainly will not if Biden is there. I think that will matter. You'll see more multilateral efforts on a bunch of issues like technology. You'll see a more social democratic approach on redistribution of wealth that will align Biden more closely with the Europeans in terms of general disposition on things like regulatory policy. But I think you'll find that the U.S. footprint of diplomatic and economic and military influence is going to continue to shift towards Asia. You'll remember Obama, with Biden as vice president, talked about the pivot to Asia, but never quite got there because a pivot requires you to actually move 1 foot away from something. That was supposed to be the Middle East and the transatlantic. It didn't happen. I think in the coming 4 years, if Biden becomes president, it will.
Ian, quite apart from where we direct our attention, is our attention as influential as it was? I mean, almost inevitably, as other countries catch up with us, certainly China, but others as well around the world in terms of relative GDP, even perhaps military forces when it comes to China, perhaps our influence might wane. But have we stepped out of the game for 4 months, 4 years in a way, by not participating in some of these multilateral alliances? And is it easy to get back in that game? Could we just step into line where we were?
Not quite, in the sense that the United States chose not to push hard at the end of the Obama administration on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, talked about it economically, but not strategically. And I think the moment for that is gone. I think there's nowhere near the support in Congress, even if Biden decided he wanted to open it. So I think that's done. I do believe that the World Trade Organization is eroding in its capacity as an organization. It's disrupted by too many forces. The United States can come back. We can appoint that appellate judge. It'll be more functional than it has been, but less than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. NATO, the United States under Trump said it was obsolete, didn't do very much that was different from the Obama administration. But we talked about Turkey already. We know who the NATO allies are. It's not as functional as it was because it doesn't have Japan or South Korea or Australia as members. It doesn't focus on cyber or technology the way it should. It's kind of a 20th century organization in a 21st century world. But let's be very clear. American power is in many ways not eroding versus other countries in the world. I mean, certainly our ability to lead by example. I mean, if you and I were to travel around the world, there are a lot of people that want to come and live in the United States, send their kids to American universities. There are very few people around the world that if you said, would you like your political system to work like this?
That's right.
There are very few people that would say that, right? Even with a nice presidential debate last night, they wouldn't say that. But there are a lot of people that would love to have American power and, you know, our reserve currency, the power of our banks, our tech companies, those things are actually getting stronger in comparison to what we're seeing around the world. They haven't eroded under 4 years of Trump.
Right. Ian, thank you so much. It's great to have you with us. And I'm delighted to say Ian Bremmer, the Eurasia Group president, will be joining us for part of our second hour at that 1 p.m. hour on radio. Coming up, we take one more look at Pennsylvania as part of our Swing State series with the state Senate Majority Leader, Jake Corman. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The idea that the stock market is booming is his only measure of what's happening. Where I come from in Scranton and Claymont, the people don't live off of the stock market.
And he doesn't come from Scranton. That's like he lived there for a short period of time before he even knew it.
We're going to move on to the next question.
And the people of Pennsylvania
Let me move on to my next.
That was one of the exchanges over Pennsylvania last night at the presidential debate. We welcome now the Republican State Senate Majority Leader in Pennsylvania. He's Jake Corman. So, Mr. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. You can clarify one thing for us right now. You're a Pennsylvanian. Is Joe Biden from Scranton or not? There seems to be a disagreement even about that.
Well, I don't know where he's from. He certainly lived there at some point in time. Where you're from is, I guess, your own determination. He did spend a short period of time in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
So give us a sense of the race that we have now just for 10 days or so left in Pennsylvania. How do you see playing out?
Very close, as it was always anticipated it would be. All the polling always tightens at the end, as it is seen. So it comes out to a turnout election, and that'll be we'll see that on election day. Obviously, with vote by mail, there's a lot of people voted already, and I still expect a big turnout on election day.
So the polls tend to indicate that the former Vice President Biden is ahead of President Trump. We all know that you have to take polls with a grain of salt. As a Republican, tell us your path to success in Pennsylvania for President Trump. We remember he won it in 2016, although just by a very small margin.
President Trump was really the first Republican since Ronald Reagan that was able to unite business and labor. Jobs are always the most important thing in Pennsylvania. And, Ronald Reagan had blue dog Democrats, and Donald Trump was the first really to bring at least the workforce, the blue collar workers, not necessarily the labor leaders, but their workforce to come on with him, and he was able to unite that coalition, and that's what led him to success in 2016, and that's what I believe will lead him to success in 2020, as the Democratic Party is kind of taken over by the progressive movement, which left a lot of the blue-collar workers behind. So that's the key coalition for the president, and if he's going to win, that's going to be the one that's going to have to deliver.
As I understand it, Donald Trump also picked up some suburban women around Philadelphia and elsewhere in Pennsylvania last time. Didn't win them, but picked up more than had been done in the past. Has he lost those women at this point? There's a lot of reporting that says that they've turned the other way.
I think not. Obviously remains to be seen, but the security issues are going to be important. Again, the Democratic Party is sort of abandoned the cities, which is unfortunate as far as safety of the cities. Obviously, suburban individuals, both men and women, like to go into the cities. The cities are a very important part of the Commonwealth, both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, plus a plethora of third-class cities. And, unfortunately, the Democratic Party and their leaders of those cities have really allowed the progressive movement to make a place unsafe. And I think the suburban individuals see that and are concerned about that. Their whole defund the police rhetoric is very unsettling. And so I think on Election Day, you'll see a much better turnout than is anticipated.
And finally, Senator, could you really clarify one thing for us? You, of course, have a Democratic governor. You have a Republican legislature. There's a lot of speculation from people not from Pennsylvania that we could end up with a conflict between the two in terms of certifying the electors. Do you anticipate that?
I do not. The legislature does not have a role in certifying the electors. That was a myth that was brought out by a sort of national magazine that was trying to cause problems in this campaign. Pennsylvania, by statute, the electors go to whoever is the winning party, and they submit those names ahead of time. Once the state certifies, the Department of State certifies the winner, those electors will be appointed. If there's a challenge to that, the courts will decide. The legislature does not have a role, so I do not see a conflict. Our statute is very clear how it all roll out, and I expect we'll follow the law.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much. That's Republican Jake Corman. He's Pennsylvania State Senate Majority Leader. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Trump last night once again criticized Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer for her actions in shutting down parts of her economy in response to COVID-19. For a sense of the reaction within the state of Michigan, we welcome now our Detroit bureau chief. He is David Welch. So, David, welcome. Great to have you with us. So we heard President Trump said that Gretchen Whitmer went way too far. Really, she's very unpopular. How popular is she in the state?
Her approval rating has been a pretty solid 52% all the way through this whole thing. And Trump's approval rating in the state, in particular as it relates to COVID response, is around 41 or 42%. So, look, by the polls, she has been beating him in terms of popularity on this. There is a very loud, very vocal group that really did not like how she handled this, but it is the Republicans in the State House, but a lot of it, kind of socially speaking, were some pretty hard right-wing groups that protested in Lansing and brought guns to the State House and that sort of thing. So really, though, the general populace in the state, her approval rating has been solid, and if it's any indicator, Joe Biden's up on the poll anywhere from 7 to 10 points in Michigan.
So, David, give us a sense of the voting and how it's going. We're hearing so much early voting, absentee ballot, mail-in voting around the country. How is it going? How's it going to break down in Michigan?
We have a lot of absentee voting going on. I think it's already almost doubled the total from the last election. Last I looked, there were almost 2 million early votes cast, and many more ballots have been applied for. And I think last time it was actually 1.4 million. So it's not quite more than double, but it's a lot more. And the total number applied for is double that. So a lot of it is the bottom line. That I think that benefits the Democrats because a lot of Democratic voters want to do the mail-in ballot. And also among those mail-in ballots, I think it's 4 times the number of young people have applied for them compared to 2016. And Trump doesn't do as well with voters who are 35 and under. So that's a good sign for Biden heading into the last week and a half before the election.
It's interesting young people are showing up, because some concerns were that we wouldn't get as many young people voting because the college campuses, which are pretty prominent in Michigan, they weren't up and running.
Yeah, but look, if they can mail in, I think they'll happily do it. I think one thing about young people is they're used to shopping online. They're not used to having to, or they don't like to have to actually go places to get things done. Maybe that carries over into voting, and now they have an option where they don't have to leave their apartment or their house to do it, and that seems to be what's happening just looking at those numbers.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your being with us. That's Bloomberg's Detroit Bureau Chief David Welch. He'll be part of our coverage on election night, Tuesday, November 3rd. That will start at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up, join us for the second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. This is Bloomberg.